Welcome to Inglet Mirror. Today we discuss humanist literary theory focusing on Plato, Aristotle, and Horace. In broad philosophical terms, humanism is a worldview or perspective that rejects anything supernatural as an explanation for existing phenomena. We can observe with our senses, and it can be explained by human investigation and thought. This view, as you might guess, forms the basis for what would become in the Western world the concept of science, the idea that observation and deduction are sufficient means for understanding how the world works and how things happen without reference to any kind of divine or extra human power. The dawn of humanism marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, the flowering of art, literature, and science, from which we frequently date the beginnings of our modern culture. Historians claimed that during the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Greek and Roman classical texts sparked the dawn of a new era in thinking. They saw the professional teachers and scholars in 14th and 15th century Italy who revived the study of Greek and Latin, rhetoric, logic, and mathematics as the basis of higher education, as the founders of the kind of high school and university curriculum on which the idea of the liberal arts education was founded. These topics formed the basis for the humanities as a discipline and distinguished humanities from divinities or the study of religious texts and doctrines. In the broadest sense, humanism is a worldview that posits human values and concerns rather than divine or supernatural values as the central focus of life and thought. Because humanist thought displaced the idea of God as the absolute center of the universe, replacing it with the idea of the human mind as a supreme power of knowledge and creation. It is sometimes referred to as secular humanism. Plato, 427 to 347 BC. The ancient Greeks had literature, but not literary theory, until Plato came along. Plato founded a philosophic tradition in which reason, the human capacity for rational thought, became the highest and most desirable form of thought and the preferable means for conveying cultural knowledge. Reason for Plato was a process of logical deduction, as demonstrated in his Socratic dialogues, stories, poetry, and drama, because they appealed to their audiences' emotions more than to their rational minds, became inferior methods for passing on cultural values and demonstrating the best ways of being. For Plato, art, because it aroused the emotions, could never be true in the way that reasoned argument could be true. Truth for Plato could only be apprehended through rational thought. Plato's preference for reason over emotion, and for the truths of mathematics over the truths of human feelings, came in part from his insistence that reality resided in forms that were eternal and unchanging, rather than in the chaotic and ever shifting material world where human beings lived. Plato and all Platonic philosophical systems that followed him imagine the world that we can perceive with our physical senses, the world we can touch, smell, see, hear, and taste as an illusion or a reproduction of another realm, a more perfect world, which is the world of the ideal. According to Plato, we can understand the world of forms only through reason and the process of logical argument. For Plato, all art was representational. For Plato, an artist's work was always twice removed from the world of truth and ideal perfection. Plato worried that art and artists might threaten social order because they might distract citizens from the pursuit of the eternal truths, which were the only unfailing source of goodness. In Book 10th of the Republic, Plato points specifically to poets and poetry in warning that all poetic imitations are ruinous to the understanding of the hearers, unless, as an antidote, they possess the knowledge of the true nature of the originals. In the Republic, he reluctantly but firmly banishes all poets as too dangerous to remain in his ideal society. His concern with the content of literature begins a tradition in literary criticism and theory which focuses on the effect that literature has on its reader or audience. This tradition of moral or didactic criticism argues that literature is so powerful, a medium for arousing emotions without necessarily presenting any rational assessment or tempering of those emotions, that it can present a constant danger to its audience, especially when that audience consists of the weak minded or least rational of a society's citizens, women and children, for example. Moral criticism focuses solely on the content of a work of literature, asking whether its effect is good or bad, rather than paying attention to its artistic or formal values. These include the ideas that, first one, the material world we perceive through our body and our senses is not the real world, but an imperfect copy of an ideal world. Second point, art, in whatever form or medium, works to reproduce or represent the perceivable material world. Third point, what is excellent and beautiful and right and good is that which approaches through rational processes, the truth of the ideal form. Fourth point, the world is organized into pairs of binary opposites, rational, irrational, good, evil, male, female, public, private. Fifth point, literature is important and needs to be regulated or supervised because it has a powerful effect on its readers. Sixth point, the content of literature, what it says and represents, is more important than the form it comes in. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. The other ancient Greek founding father of Western thought, by contrast, is less interested in the content of literature than in its forms. Aristotle begins with the idea that art is not necessarily an imitation or a reproduction of nature, of the world we perceive with our senses, and thus is not necessarily an inferior reproduction or copy of nature. For Aristotle, art is a process of putting the events of nature into a medium, such as words or paint, that improves on or completes nature. For Aristotle, art is not necessarily the binary opposite of reason, and thus threatening to logic and rationality. Aristotle understands that the pleasure we take in representations conveys another type of truth, not a disruptive and dangerous falsehood. For Aristotle, reality is the ever changing world of appearances and perceptions, the ordinary world of things and events. Plato thought that any particular chair was only an imitation, an inferior copy of the ideal form of chair that could not be perceived directly through our senses, but only deduced by logical processes. Aristotle, by contrast, argues that the only way we can know the essence of chair, the true meaning of chair, is through individual instances of chairs. For Aristotle, form exists only in the concrete examples of that form, not in some eternal ideal abstraction. Aristotle's truth, what his philosophy seeks to understand and teach, resides in discovering the rules and principles that govern how things work and take on meaning in our material world. Aristotelian thought forms the foundations for science in Western philosophy. Aristotle's science desires to catalogue and classify the things of the material world. His methods work to discover similarities and differences in form, and to deduce general principles of organization or taxonomy from these forms rather than in the specific operation of any individual. Aristotle treats poetry and all art forms like biology. He is interested in discovering or creating ways to identify characteristics of various forms of poetry and then developing systematic categories through which to classify these forms. While Plato found the tradition of moral criticism by worrying about what a work of poetry does to its audience, Aristotle found the tradition of genre criticism by investigating what a particular work is rather than what it does. Aristotle's Poetics examines literature in terms of its internal structure. It focuses on drama, working to identify the formal properties of comedy and tragedy. Comedy, according to Aristotle, must deal with base people, with peasants and average folk, while tragedy must confine itself to the lives of the nobility. Aristotelian criticism is interested in discovering the essential qualities of each of the different kinds of forms of literature. Aristotle's artist is not just an imitator, then, but also a creator. And this ability to create gives artists a more important role in Aristotle's world than the suspect one they have in Plato's Republic. Artists are important to Aristotle because art imposes order on what might otherwise be a disordered and chaotic natural world. With Plato and Aristotle, we see the emergence of the two most fundamental strands or traditions in Western thought about art and literature: the concern with the content and effect of a work of art, and the concern with the form and unity of a work of art. The first, following Plato, might be called moral criticism. The second, following Aristotle, could be broadly labeled formal or aesthetic criticism. Horace, 65 to 8 BC. Horace was a Roman poet, best known for his satires and his lyric odes. His letters in verse, particularly his Ars Poetica, outline his belief about the art and craft of poetry. His main contribution to the traditions of literary theory we are exploring lie in his articulation of the purpose of poetry or literature in general. It is sweet and useful. Horace insists that literature serves the didactic purpose which had been Plato's main concern, and that it provides pleasure. The two goals are not incompatible, as Plato had feared. Poetry is a useful teaching tool, Horace argues, precisely because it is pleasurable. The pleasure of poetry makes it popular and accessible, and its lessons thus can be widely learned. Like Plato, Horace sees nature as the primary source for poetry. But he argues that poets should imitate other authors as well as imitating nature. Horace thus establishes the importance of a poet knowing a literary tradition and respecting inherited forms and conventions as well as creating new works. The writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Horace pretty much defined the parameters of thought about literature from the ancient world until the Renaissance. The Renaissance discourse on literary theory was stimulated, at least in part, by the rediscovery of Aristotle's Poetics, a text which had been lost to Western culture during the Dark Ages. Thank you for watching this video.